6:30. Okay, we're going to make a start. Thank you for those of you who are returning, and welcome to new attendees. This is the third session of Dr. Chris Boredom's short course on Slavoj Žižek. First session on ontology, and the second session on death drive are both on our YouTube channel. If you would like to go back and have a watch if you missed the first two. And tonight, Chris is moving on to the subject of freedom. If you don't have a handout with quotes on it, let us know and we'll bring one to you. And for those people who are joining us online, it is up on our website, QSCP.net. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and also acknowledge that learning has been going on this country for time immemorial. As I said, tonight's session is on freedom, and after tonight we'll be breaking for a fortnight, so there will be no class next week, and we'll be back on the 18th. So that's plenty of time to rewatch the lectures, read through the documents, and as I mentioned in the last session, if you would like access to those suggested readings, please get in contact and we can lend you those. And without further ado, I will throw over to Dr. Chris Boredom. Žižek on freedom.
Good evening, everybody. So, as I was putting together this lecture, it was really quite an enjoyable experience for me. The theme of freedom is that the whole question in philosophy is like whether or not we have free will is one of the questions that first drew me into philosophy, well before I found Žižek. So it's a question that fascinates me, and I had a great experience as I was putting together this lecture of repeatedly questioning whether or not I actually did understand Žižek's position. So, as always, if there's any questions or anything you think I'm not being clear about, please do ask questions. And hopefully what I'm going to present is coherent. But even like today, as I was like going through what I was going to say, I'm like, yeah, but I was like coming up with counter arguments against Žižek's position. So tonight's definitely going to be a bit of a journey. Žižek, freedom. It is only in fate we find freedom. And as with all of the sessions, they're sort of all grounded in a paradox. And the paradox for Žižek's concept of freedom is that to understand, you only get to freedom or only understand freedom if you take determinism to the end. And that real freedom is a type of owning of one's fate. It's following through on one's necessity. I'm going to start by going through some definitions, just so that as I'm talking about the different options of how we conceptualize freedom, we're all on the same page. Because I do want this session to be an intervention into the perennial question of, are we free, and what does it mean to be free? And I do think Žižek's position it does respond to those questions in a very important way. So if you're going to be a determinist, you're going to be claiming that everything that happens is causally determined. There's a reason why something happens. So you just have you have cause and effect. If you're a hard determinist, though, you're going to say, yes, everything that happens is caused, but there's only one way it can happen. So when you think hard determinism, I want you to think of has everyone heard the concept of Laplace's demon? The idea that if we know all the natural laws and we knew the position of every single particle or every little piece of material substance, we could perfectly predict what was going to happen next. And there's only one thing that can happen next. That's hard determinism. So that's the idea that there's only one way that things can happen because of the fact of what exists and because of the laws that guide what can happen regarding what exists. The opposite position on hard determinism is voluntarism, and that's the idea that a human agent can start a new causal chain. That's like the direct opposite of hard determinism. So voluntarism is where we're radically free. We can actually do something that's unique in the world. We can do something just because we want to do it. That's voluntarism. Compatibilism is the concept that our idea of freedom is actually compatible with the idea of determinism. So if you're a compatibilist, you believe that there's really no problem of free will. that the problem of free will, that if everything's determined, then we can't be free, is just a problem with the way that we're generating concepts rather than actually a problem. My argument tonight is that Žižek says yes to determinism, no to hard determinism, no to voluntarism, yes to compatibilism. And we're going to start with a quote from Žižek. And then, like we did last week, so start with the quote and then try to say, okay, well, what's he actually talking about here? And he says this in an interview. Here is my point. We already made some ethico-political decisions. This is what I would like to emphasize. We are much more free and responsible than we think. Usually it is fashionable to say, old Marxists say things like this, that we just appear to be free. You go to the store and buy whatever you want, but in reality, you are manipulated. It's true. But we are also way more free than we think we are. If you believe in some kind of destiny, it makes life easier. The difficult thing is to break destiny. So that's where we're going to start. We're less free than we think, but we're also more free than we think. What does that mean? This is the structure of the session. I'm going to start by talking about false definitions of freedom, or at least what Žižek would call false definitions of freedom. That's sort of going to be laying out the groundwork of what are some, when we say the word freedom, what are the different things we're probably thinking about? And what are the different ways that people sort of approach the problem of freedom today? Then I'm going to try to define Žižek's compatibilism. So I'm just going to straightforward say this is what Žižek thinks freedom is, which isn't going to make sense at first. And then I'm going to try to explain where that comes from and how it works. But then we're going to go through his theorization of the act, which is going to be especially important when we come back to the politics. So the act is not the same thing as although the act is a free act for Žižek, there's free acts that aren't an act. So the act is think of it as a subcategory of a free act. And then we're going to respond to criticisms of that and look at, which has been, because that's one part of Žižek's thought that's been criticized. So I want to respond to some of the criticisms of that. But tonight, we've looked at the ontology, the dialectic of materialism. That's going to come in tonight. The death drive is going to come back tonight. And then the act, we're going to come back to like for the rest of these sessions. Like it sort of is like a key building block for how you can understand Žižek's politics. Okay. False freedoms. Gone through definitions. Here's the different ways of approaching freedom today. If you're going to look at freedom today from a dominant scientific materialist perspective, this would be saying that, well, look, human beings we're material entities made of material things. There's no such thing as voluntary choice. If you look into our brains when we're making a choice, you're not going to see any self making a decision. You're just going to see, I don't know what you see, like what, neurons, electricity moving on neurons. You're just going to see material things. And a stance from that, which you often hear, is that our free will, our sense of self, these are just illusions. Like a dominant proponent of this would be someone like Sam Harris, who is like a cognitive scientist. He's like, look, we looked inside the brain to try and find the self. There's no self there. It just wasn't there. This is also famous experiments by Libet, who he did experiments sort of showing that he basically had people make a decision about whether they were going to go, like, if you had two options, choose the left one or the right one. And he basically showed that the part of the brain that decides what's going to happen occurs before you're conscious. So by the time people are conscious of the decision they're going to make, the decision's already been made. So those sorts of, that scientific way of approaching things generally says, look, we don't have free will. We're not free. We're just material things that are determined by material forces. Hard determinism. Not all cognitive scientists believe that, of course, but it's just like a dominant thing you'll hear. Under that Foucauldian idea we were talking about last week of discursive materialism, you also have the idea that things like the self and freedom are sort of illusory things that here now we have the idea that they're more effective discourses. So that if you have this idea that this is who I am and this is what I live for, it's like, that's great, but that's really an effective discourse, and in believing that, you're probably just reinforcing the dominant, the things of power. So for someone, especially like for someone like Deleuze, the idea of believing in or an idea of freedom for Deleuze is just like this deterritorialization where you just go against any idea of self, any idea that you have responsibility for what you're going to do. You get rid of those sorts of categories, and then you get some. If there's freedom as thing, then that's how you that's how you do it. So you got two sort of conceptions of freedom there. Right-wing discourse. Freedom really reaches its epitome in right-wing discourse today in something like the sovereign citizen movement. So here you have the idea of freedom is basically the freedom to do what I want any other time. I always think of the freedom, the song, I'm free to do what I want any other, a purely negative conception of freedom. It's like freedom means I don't have to care what you think. I don't have to care what anyone else wants of me. I'm not responsible for anyone else. I'm a sovereign citizen. I'll do whatever I want, right? So that's a right-wing conception of freedom. Freedom is something like an indifference to the other. And it's a freedom from constraint, something like a negative freedom. On the left wing, if I was going to say, like, how is freedom really conceptualized there, just again, it's like in an ideological way without too much like just how people are generally thinking about it, not necessarily theorizing it. It'd be something like freedom becomes the ability to express oneself in unique and individual ways, like sort of express one's true self. And so I'd sort of see that as whether and with whatever identity that you have. So it's sort of freedom that you can associate with a movement that's based on identity politics. And of course, so that freedom becomes like a freedom as a right to express one's true self, which is also going to be slightly different from what Žižek is proposing, just because the idea of there being a true self is going to be very problematic from anytime you have a psychoanalytical perspective, right? Then you also just have a consumer capitalist idea of freedom. So in our everyday world, we see advertisements and through social media and so on, we're constantly interpolated as consumers. And here, freedom just is basically a freedom to indulge in hedonistic, individualistic pleasure, right? And often, and which in our culture turns into, or our dominant paradigm turns into something like the ability to choose what product you want. That's freedom. And this is just Žižek on that point. So there are a multitude of examples of unfreedom appearing in the guise of its opposite. When we are deprived of universal health care, we are told that we are given a new freedom of choice to choose our healthcare provider. When we can no longer rely on long-term employment and are compelled to search for a new precarious position every couple of years, we are told that we are given the opportunity to reinvent ourselves and discover new unexpected creative potentials that lurked in our personality. When we have to pay for the education of our children, we are told to become entrepreneurs of the self, acting like a capitalist who has to choose freely how he will invest the resources he possesses or has borrowed in education, health, or travel. Constantly bombarded by imposed free choices, forced to make decisions for which we are mostly not even properly qualified, we more and more experience our freedom for what it effectively is, a burden that deprives us of the true choice of change. And this is something that's going to come up again and again tonight, this distinction between someone giving you a field of choices and saying, look how free you are, you have all these choices within this particular framing of the world, versus a radical questioning of that very framing of choices, and actually completely inverting the field. And this is a Panchik making the same point. The symbolic order, which is principally our economic order, appears as a playground within which we are free to change anything we want, to play with different possibilities and endless variations. Yet we are utterly powerless in relation to the crucial parameters of this socio-economic structure itself. And you also get in there sort of a germ of the key problem that Žižek sees with identity politics, in that this idea of expressing oneself in one's unique individuality is completely complicit with a dominant paradigm where the point of freedom is just to be an individual self and expressing oneself and so on, without questioning the dominant economic social structures that are causing so much suffering and injustice and so forth. So that's the quote, and we've made that distinction. So we can think of those two levels of freedom. The choice between the level of choices within the coordinates of a symbolic order, and these, you can think of these as choices determined by a big other. So when I say the big other, you just have to think of this as a shared fiction that we inhabit whenever we use language or whenever we have a shared social space. The big other is what we implicitly appeal to as being the point at which meaning is secured, which is of course fictional. So if, as a simple example, for instance, when sort of how politeness functions, if I say something like, I need to go to the bathroom, you'll know what is actually going to happen, and I know what's going to happen. So why do we bother saying the bathroom? Well, it's because we can't let the big other know. Like there's an entity there. It's like there's the thing that knows the rules of the place that we're still appealing to. It's also one thing that sort of guarantees that when we use language, we have some sense that, oh, what I'm saying makes sense, because we have a sense of there's a place in which that meaning is guaranteed. We're constantly positing this is a big other where meaning is finalized. So if you think of the big other, just think of it as the reason why when we line up, if you're lining up for something, like at a bakery, let's just say bakery, you're lining up and someone pushes in line and like everyone knows you shouldn't do that. It's like what you're really appealing to is there's a big other who's looking at this and going, that's not right. Yeah, right. So anytime you have human beings acting together in some shared symbolic space, you have this big other. So on one level, you have the choice is determined by a big other, and on the other level, you have a choice that shows that the big other doesn't exist. The story that best illustrates the existence of the big other is just the Emperor's New Clothes, and so I'll just quickly retell the story. It's such a great story. So basically, there's an emperor, and he wants to get new clothes that look fantastic, and these two new people show up who say we make the best clothes ever, but our clothes are really special. Only intelligent people can see our clothes. So if you're stupid and we make you clothes, you're just going to see nothing. But you're not stupid, so that's not going to happen to you. And so they start making these clothes together, and then they sort of hold them out to the emperor, and they're like, look at these great clothes we've made you. And the emperor's like, can't see anything, but he doesn't want to look stupid. So he says, oh yeah, they look really good. Don't they look good, advisors? And all the advisors are like, yeah, they don't want to look stupid either. They're like, yeah, they're really good, they're amazing. And so on. And so everyone just agrees that these clothes are incredible. They keep working on these invisible clothes and keep bringing them out and saying, look how good they are now. And the emperor's like, wow, I love them even more now. Aren't they even better? And everyone keeps agreeing, yeah. Until the day of the actual parade comes and the emperor puts on, he's just completely naked. He's not wearing any clothes at all. He thinks he's clothed, and everyone's telling him he's clothed, and that he looks amazing. And then he starts walking out in the parade, and everyone who knows that only stupid people can't see the clothes are all like cheering, going, well, that's amazing. Until a child says, hey, he's naked, and then all of a sudden everyone just starts laughing. Like it completely destroys. Yeah. And now that's a good example of a big other operating. Right? The emperor is, if the emperor is naked, no one will see he's naked if the big other doesn't see he's naked. It works, it functions. The moment when someone goes, no, hang on, he's naked, the whole thing falls apart. And that very much happens in, like, if you look at like the credit crisis of 2008, then basically what it was. It was just like everyone going, oh, hang on, there's nothing here. And the moment that's just pointed out, all of a sudden it becomes obvious that there was nothing there, and the whole thing just collapses. So big others are, that's a good example of like how the big other would work. So one way of thinking of Žižek's concept of freedom is that when you have a genuine free act, what it reveals is the absence of a big other. Because for Lacan and for Žižek, there is no big other. So now that doesn't mean I'll have to leave that for another week. Like, well, then how are we supposed to act in the world? Like generally, if we're social beings, we can't really act all the time if there's not a big other. That's just impossible. Be positive all the time. You just have to be a social human being. But what it does mean is that anytime you have a claim to, I don't know, if someone says to you, like, this social order is something like inevitable or natural, and they appeal to some sort of transcendent entity that's guaranteeing its stability, that's something like appealing to a big other. Like that's the big other that doesn't exist, right? Okay, so they're the two different. If you think of those two different levels, you're already making a bit of headway into how Žižek thinks of freedom. But I want to problematize things before we get started on what Žižek's idea of freedom is. can we just go back to thinking of what we've learned so far about Žižek's idea of the subject? So far we've learned that Žižek's idea of the subject is that it's basically what makes material reality not all. So to think substance and subject is just to think the incompleteness of substance. Substance can never be completed because there's this thing called a subject, which means the substance cannot be one with itself. It's always eternally incomplete. And last week we looked at the idea of the death drive as a possible account for one way in which nature, substance is incomplete with itself. Nature seems to give rise to these drives which persist in their own sake, which comes from instinct, which come from some sort of natural purpose, but which then sort of are derailed from that and begin to persist for their own sake. And that concept of that, remember we use that word acephalous, headless, this headless, insistent, repetitive, sticking to a point for no other reason than itself is going to be really important for Žižek's concept of freedom and his politics and so on. And that drive, nature seems to then give birth to these things that persist in their own way that are no longer tied to nature. That's the really important point. So they're indifferent to any symbolic rules or any sort of natural rules. The key problem here is that both those ways of conceptualizing the subject, when you talk about subject as death drive or subject as this point of negativity, it seems to be very different than what we think of when we think of a self-determining subject. A self-determining subject would be a subject that can say, this is what I want to be, this is who I choose to be, I am choosing this, and it's not being chosen for me, and this is who I am. And how can nothing do that? That's the key problem. It looks like Žižek's conception of the subject, although it gives you a necessary condition for freedom, something like, well, there's a gap in material reality where the subject can come in, it doesn't seem to give you, at least on the surface, a subject that can actually self-determine, which is what I think we mean when we mean like a robust account of freedom. So the subject is not a rational agent that Žižek's talking about. It's not someone who's subtracted from reality. Sorry, it's radically subtracted from reality, but it's not a transcendent hovering above reality, looking at all the options, using reason to make decisions. That's not the subject. And it's also not, it's an immanent gap. It's not transcendent, so it's not beyond reality. It's the incompleteness in reality itself. And remember, the example used for it is it's a nothing. In the same way that if you have a vase and the nothing within the vase is a something that's still a nothing, but it's different from the nothing outside the vase, that's the subject, right? It's the substance, the incompleteness of the substance that makes the subject. So the subject it's a nothing. How can a nothing be free, right? These are the problems that on the surface we have. So what I'm going to try and explain tonight is how you do get a robust conception of freedom with that idea of the subject. That's what my goal is. This is one of Žižek's latest books, by the way. Freedom, a disease without cure. And so you'll notice that when Žižek talks about freedom straight away, he wants to, first of all, try to get you away from thinking of freedom as this positive thing. In fact, for him, true freedom, is something you're probably going to want to run from. It's not something that we're going to want to embrace. But also, you can't avoid it. You can't get rid of it. The moment that the moment that you have some sense of reality, you also have this freedom that you can't get away from. Okay, so what have we established so far? What we've established is it looks like a Žižek conception of freedom is going to be very hard to understand. That's what we've established. So please bear with me. So my strategy is this. Sorry. Bridie just sent a message, and it's a really good example of the big other, so I think I will share it as well, because it is one of my favorite examples as well. So if you imagine two couples having dinner, and one of the couples is having an affair. And let's say, the man in one of the couples is having an affair. And everyone knows that he's having an affair. So no one at the table is ignorant. That dinner can go on fine, and everyone can get on and just talk, and everything's just goes as normal. But if the woman who's being cheated on all of a sudden says, hey, by the way, why are we acting so normal? He's like having an affair on me. We all know it. All of a sudden you can't go on as normal anymore. And what what the Lacanian would say is like, yeah, because what you did is you let the big other know. Everything's fine. You hide things from a big other. You had a similar thing when, another example Žižek uses is back in like Stalinist Russia, when they would like get rid of some of their high, I don't know, I'm laughing at this. They get rid of someone like a high-ranking person would suddenly have to be like they get rid of them, and they have their official encyclopedias. And instead of reprinting the encyclopedias, what they do is send out a paper, a page, and say, on this, you have to get this page and paste it over this page of the encyclopedia, like we're replacing it. And so again, the point is it's completely useless. Like like everyone knows you're manipulating information, so why bother making this official thing? And the answer is, well, we're not doing it for us, we're doing it for the other. So we can have this shared fiction. It's a little bit the same way in which, you have, like have your sports clubs and they have awards nights. Generally the awards nights are pretty boring. Like, you sort of go through the process anyway. It's like, why? It's like all graduation ceremonies. Same thing. It's like no one wants to be there. Like the people graduating, it's like I'm taking time out. Like the people watching, but it's like, yeah, but we have to let the big other know. The big other has to know that this person graduated. So there's that's sort of how another example of how the big other functions. Before we get started, okay, Žižekian compatibilism. He's so free there in the mountains, like Sound of Music. Okay.
It's when you're going for a walk in the mountain range, it's a better, what's the Deleuze quote?
I don't know.
Yeah, but a schizophrenic going for a walk is a better model of a healthy patient than someone in the couch of a psychiatrist.
Yes, good example. Let's see how that goes with Žižek's idea of freedom. So Žižek's idea of freedom is the freedom to choose your necessity. It's where you get to a point where you cannot do otherwise. So this is where the definition of freedom becomes really different from how we spontaneously, I guess in our own culture, we generally think of freedom. So the best example that Žižek uses is the example of falling in love. When you fall in love with someone, it's not like going into the supermarket and choosing like a particular brand of ice cream. It's like, do I want chocolate ice cream? I feel like I'm talking like Žižek now. Do I want the chocolate ice cream or strawberry ice cream? Which option do I want? When you fall in love, like the metaphor fall in love sort of captures it well. You're walking along, everything's fine, your life is normal, and then all of a sudden you fall, and like you're obsessed falling on word, but you're really interested in this person, and you can't think about anything else, and they completely derail your life. But all of a sudden, choosing to follow through on that and choosing to let that person becomes the ultimate expression of who you are. Or another example would be if you're in some situation where, say, your ethics were compromised. Say you had a situation where your boss said, "Look, I want to fire your coworker. I don't have a good reason for it, but if you invent this lie, I'll give you a promotion. What do you think?" And if you have that sense of, I can't do that, and I can't explain to you why I can't do it, but I can't do anything else but not go through with that. That would actually go completely against everything I am. Then you have some sense of and when you have that sense of, this is me, if I went against this, I would no longer be able to be the person I am. Now you've got some sense of what real freedom is. But do you see how different that is from the idea of freedom as just doing whatever I want? Because from a Kantian perspective or a Hegelian perspective, doing whatever you want is not freedom. Doing whatever you want is just being determined by what Kant would call your pathological concerns. It's like freedom. I want to be free from work so I can sit home and, I don't know, play computer games all day. Oh, that's a bad thing. I'm supposed to do that. Or I just want to sit and I just want to eat chocolate cake and watch reruns of The Sopranos. Say that for Kant and Hegel is not really freedom. That's just allowing yourself to be determined by like sort of your natural desires. Freedom is rather something that comes out of discipline, a determined and sort of a determined, repetitive following through on a particular thing that you have to do because you can't do otherwise. Something that involves you in having to sort of exhibit self-control and so on. So following through on a love relationship, so this is what is so important, but also so confusing. So when you think of that experience of falling in love, on one hand, it's like, I didn't choose this. To say that when you fall in love with someone, if the account was going to be, oh yeah, well, why did I fall in love with this woman? Well, there's like there was this woman and then this woman. I sort of looked at all the different choices and I gave them a score out of 10 and she was the best one. She won. And I said to her, yeah, it's on. And that's just not what love is. Like falling in love means you have that experience of, oh, this person is the absolute for me. I can't live without them. They're everything to me. If this person were to tell me they don't like me, then I don't care what anyone else thinks. I only care what this one person thinks. It's this type of insane attachment to sort of this exception, the exception to the whole, which fills out everything. That this is all that matters to me. I have a daughter. She's 11, so we listen to a lot of is it Olivia Rodriguez? I don't know her name. But all her songs are basically about that. It's all about, and then it's great though, because some of those songs now it's like, why did I even think that you were great? You're not great at all, but I thought you were great, but now you're just a no one. I don't know, I'll be crazy. But then there's another song about, she's in love with another guy, and so on and so on. But the point is that when we talk about love, we do talk about things like as if it's fate, right? So these high points of ethical freedom, or of absolute freedom, it's not that you're choosing them because you want to do them. They happen to you and you have no choice but to follow through on them. And even though they're fated, even though you get the sense that this is who I am and I can't do otherwise, they're the highest expression of freedom. It's like if you came to me and said, oh, Chris, you can't have this ice cream anymore. I'm like, I did like that ice cream, but that's okay, I can give it up. Or it's like if you said, you can't read Žižek anymore. I don't know about this one. Maybe this is like a ethical call. They'd be like, yeah, okay, I could probably live without that. But if you came to me and said, okay, you're not allowed to love your wife anymore. You're not allowed to love your family anymore. It's like, I can't not do that and still be me. Like there's a sense of that's an expression of who I am in sort of my deepest sense of self. That's when you begin to get the idea of what freedom is. It's not doing what you want. It's following through on something that you feel compelled to do. So that's the first thing. I explained it a lot. I'm probably going to explain it again. But the first thing you have to realize that, and this is how he says it, a free act retroactively determines its own causes. So the point here is that when I choose to follow through on the necessity, I am making a choice. The choice is not whether or not I love the person, or the choice is not whether or not I think this is the right thing to do. But the choice is what I'm allowing to determine my choices. So the choice is I'm choosing, I don't choose to fall in love, but I choose to affirm the causes that led me to fall in love. So I affirm, the Hegelian thing is like positing the presuppositions. I affirm the things that led me to that led for that to be my necessity. Okay. Next, true freedom reveals the incompleteness of our reality. The point there, I'm going to come back to that. The point there is, again, if you think through determinism to its end, you get stuck on this subject that's still there that you can't get rid of, and that's the thing that we get the idea of actually what freedom is. And when you get the point about freedom, and one of the things that these free acts show is the radical fragility of our worlds. And again, I'm going to use the example of falling in love. But in the example of falling in love, if you have that experience of falling in love, and it's like things that you once thought were important are no longer important. Or another example would be like for me, it was having a child. That moment you sort of have a child, things that used to be important sort of don't become important anymore. Like there's a radical shift in just the way the world is appearing. There's a sense in which the fragility of what you thought was substantial, freedom sort of shows up that what you thought was substantial and stable suddenly dissolves. One of the and we haven't spoken about this too much, but one of the implications of Žižek's dialectical materialism is that the social structures that determine our symbolic reality, because they are based on fictions, they're based on symbolic fictions. The thing that keeps them going is everyone's shared belief. But in fact, there's nothing substantial there. All it takes, and so they're actually more fragile than we want to admit or we want to think. The only thing you need for the only thing you need for the value of money to completely dissolve into nothing is for everyone just to stop believing it was worth anything. That's it. There's nothing beyond the value of money other than a shared fiction, other than the shared belief. There's nothing substantial there. Let that thought detonate in your brain. I should say that, sorry. Just reference to Sam Harrison. I should have said that. Okay, lastly. But can you see that as a good example? Like if you think of the belief in money as a stable thing kills people. Like that belief that if I do this, I'll make more money, but it will mean that these people have to be out of a job. It will mean that these people suffer. It will mean that this environment is destroyed. But I'm going to do it anyway because it means more money. But that money is a fiction. That's when, like that. So first of all, yeah, it's incredibly fragile. The only thing that makes the money worthwhile is that people believe it. And if everyone tomorrow said, no, actually, we're not going to believe in that anymore, it just disappears. But the second thing is, those symbolic fictions have real effects. So you can't say, oh, it's a symbolic fiction, so it doesn't affect the real world. It completely affects the real world. Like people live and die according to symbolic fictions. So it's not a message saying, oh, so the point is, yes, they're incredibly fragile, but they're also incredibly important and incredibly dangerous. Oh, but also like incredibly good. They're good, yes. So Žižek is a compatibilist. So the last thing is that he thinks that freedom of determinism are not incompatible. But he's a non-reductive materialist. So whereas a hard determinist, say if you had a cognitive scientist who was a hard determinist, or anyone who's a hard determinist, so there's only one way things can happen, the only thing that exists is material reality, then they'd say, everything that I do or say is an effect of this material reality. And if I completely understood that material reality, I have a complete explanation for what's occurring. If you believe that, then everything that happens is reducible to some material state of affairs. So Žižek is a non-reductionist. He says it's true that all there is material reality, but that material reality cannot give you a complete explanation of everything. Why not? Not because there's something that we don't know, but because it's incomplete itself. That material reality is not all. So there isn't a complete material reality that's causing everything because it's perpetually unfinished. Okay, so we're going to do our first thought experiment. Imagine you're visited by a demon. I sound like a Nisha now. And the demon says to you, look, up to this point, you believe that everything you're doing is your free will. But in fact, everything you're doing is completely fate. There's nothing you can do that is not already predetermined by fate. God is real and God knows and has pre-planned every decision you're going to make. And even though you're going to make that decision and you're going to think it's free, it's not free. You're just fated to do these things. Now, how would you react to that? And if you think about how you react to that, you begin to understand how when you assert an absolute determinism, you begin to get freedom erupted in that. Because you can decide still, what do you do with that information? Do you just accept it and go along with it and say, you're right, everything I do is fated. From now on, every decision I make, I'm not going to take responsibility for it. And if anyone tries to blame me for anything I do, I'm going to tell them, listen, a demon visited me, a very trustworthy demon, assured me God was real, and everything I do is actually fated. And so I can't take responsibility for it. Or are you going to claim, no, I'm going to fight this. Tell me something, tell me one thing that God said I'm going to do, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm just going to prove that this is wrong. Now, if the point is, if you accept this determinism, this absolute hard determinism, we can still take a position in relation to that. There still seems to be something that even if I know that everything I do is fated and you tell that to me, I still can't just be a fated thing. If you tell a human subject, you're fated, they can either go, yeah, I'm fated. I'm going to live as if I'm fated. Or they can say, no, I'm not fated. I still have freedom. I'm going to insist I have freedom and act like I don't have freedom. And if you try to control me, I'm going to do the exact opposite of what you say. There isn't, it's a similar thing if people, people talk about the meaning of life. And people want to make the claim that if there's a God, if there's no God, then there's no meaning of life. But imagine if there was a God, and the God came and said to you, listen, I am real, and I did create you, and here's the purpose I have for you. Here's your purpose. Life. It's like, good, but you still have to choose to accept it or not. Like, just God's coming down and visiting you in person saying, look, here, I'm giving you your purpose. You still are in a position to go, yeah, that is my purpose. Okay, I'm going to own that purpose. I'm going to say that is my purpose. Or you're in a position to go, no, that's not my purpose. I'm going to choose not to live according to that purpose. I'm going to defy that. So that the idea that if you just have a God, you suddenly solve the problem of meaning of life is problematic, because what it ignores is just this subjective dimension. If you have an absolute, if you imagine a world where everything's absolutely fated, or imagine a world where there's a completely full meaning and purpose, so that the meaning of life is no longer a problem, because we can just ask God and God appears in front of us and says, here's the meaning of life. We go, thank you. I don't have to search anymore. The point is, even if God came down and said, here is the purpose of life, I made you, here's the reason I made you, answer to the meaning of life, there it is. You still have to choose whether you accept it or not. You never get rid of the subject. So what is this thing that can, even if it's completely told or is completely framed in this world where everything is, you're going to roll it, everything's completely there, your purpose is determined, your fate is determined. What is this thing that even then says, I don't know, what should I do? And you can't even think of what it would be without that subject being there. That is, if I was going to approach you and say everything is completely determined, and we take that to the end, you still have this leftover. It's like, yes, okay, I accept everything's determined, but even as I accept everything's determined, I'm still this thing that's not determined that's accepting that. That's when you begin to get this idea of where freedom comes in at the end of determinism. And here Žižek talks about the film noir hero. So often in a film noir text, the hero gets to the end of their quest, and they realize that the whole time they've been manipulated. So they did all these things out of free will. They thought they were helping a damsel in distress. They thought they were doing this in the name of justice, but in fact, the whole time they've been manipulated, and they've just been, they've just murdered someone for someone else's benefit. And they suddenly realize, I'm not in control of everything. I'm a victim of other things controlling me. And the point Žižek makes here is that even then, to simply endorse and assume that predicament is also an illusion. So if at that point the film noir hero goes, I am just completely manipulated, well, you know what? I'm just going to be a manipulated person and give into that and continue to be manipulated. I myself be manipulated. That's still an ethical choice. You don't get to make that option. Even if you do have that option of, I'm just going to accept that, there's still that sense of a subject making a decision there. And this is Frank Rudder. The fatalist gesture is the subject. It is the gesture of subjectivization. There is no subject without fatalism, and there is no fatalism without subjectivity. Subjects without fatalism are blind, and so is fatalism without subjectivity. And again, the point is that if you think fatalism through to its end, and you find that leftover, that thing that can't quite, that's still there, that's relating to fate in some way, that's when you're getting the leftover, the subject, the thing that doesn't fit in with fate. And this is what Žižek says is wrong with this idea that we are chained by natural determinism. So this is Žižek responding to the idea of the hard determinants. So the idea that everything we do is just decided for us. That everything we do is just a response to our natural inclinations. So this is what's wrong with the notion of being imprisoned by the chains of natural determinism. We thereby obfuscate the fact that we are part of reality, that the possible local conflict between our free striving and the external reality that resists it is a conflict inherent in reality itself. That is to say, there's nothing oppressive or constraining about the fact that our innermost strivings are predetermined. When we feel thwarted in our freedom by the pressure of external reality, there must be something in us, some desire or striving, which is thus thwarted. But where do such strivings come from, if not from the same reality? Our free will does not in some mysterious way disturb the natural course of things. It is part and parcel of this course. When a determinist claims that our free choice is determined, this does not mean that our free will is somehow constrained, that we are forced to act against our will. What is determined is the very thing that we want to do freely, that is, without being thwarted by external obstacles. So if you're going to be a hard determinist, and you're going to say, look, we're not really free, the idea that that we're making choices is just an epiphenomenal, which means that it's a phenomenon that's caused by material causes, but isn't and is reducible to those, but in itself cannot affect material reality. What you're positing is that there must be the fact that we'd be frustrated with that, or the fact that we don't believe that that's normal, means that there must be this thing that's being produced by the brain or something, which is in some way not happy with nature, or not a part of nature. And Žižek's reply to that is just that there is no part of us that is not a part of nature. Like there's no, so in the experience of falling in love, for instance, of course that's caused. Of course there's a natural substance, there's all these sorts of things that cause it. But the fact that it's caused, the fact that it's part of that natural substance, doesn't take away from the fact that it's also a part of my freedom. So whatever freedom is for Žižek, it's not something that is occurring outside of nature. Rather, it would be something like the expression of it'd be like nature's similar to death drive, right? Nature's inconsistency expressing itself. It'd be something like that instead. Okay, I'm going to take a 10-minute break, and we will continue after that. And look a little bit more at this idea of if you follow determinism through, you end up with some concept of freedom. And this is a Panchik talking about Kant, and basically, this is one of the reasons why you have like the thinkers after Kant dealing with Kant, because for Kant, he ends up having, not because it's Panchik's freedom, but he sort of says, well, according to theoretical reasoning, so according to how we're looking at the world, human action is always going to be just look like it's determined. But if you want to reason practically, that is, if you want to reason as an ethical creature, you have to posit some sense of free will, and those two realms are just incompatible. So you can either approach the world theoretically, and if you ask the question there, why did you slap that person in the face? It's like, oh, well, there was electrons going through my brain and neurons going through my brain that caused nerves to move, and it moved my hand, and that's what happened. But if you wanted to answer in the realm of practical reason, it just becomes a different question. It's like, why did you, as an individual who knows that you're subject to the laws of reason, why did you choose to hit that person? So, and for Kant, these two things just don't go together. Like, you can either think practically or you can think theoretically. Theoretically, you're never going to see freedom because you don't posit freedom at that level. And freedom is just not something you're ever going to observe in the world. But if you want to reason practically, you have to assume freedom. So Panchik has a little bit of a different take on it. So she says that Kant holds that as human beings, we are part of nature, which means that we are entirely, internally, and externally subject to the laws of causality. Hence, our freedom is limited not only from the outside, but also from the inside. We are no more free in ourselves than we are in the world. Which seems on the surface to be pretty hard to determine, right? Kant does not try to disclose the freedom of the subject somewhere beyond causal determination. On the contrary, he enables it to become manifest by insisting to the bitter end on the reign of causal determination. What he shows is that there is in causal determination a stumbling block in the relation between cause and effect. In this, we encounter the ethical subject in the strict sense of the word. The subject as such is the effect of a causal determination, but not in a direct way. The subject is the effect of this something which only makes the relation between cause and its effect possible. And then she continues. Only at this point, after you've followed the postulate of determinism to its end, does a leftover element that can serve as the basis for the constitution subject appear, which is the point I've already been trying to be making, but I'm going to make it again in a slightly different way. One has to discover the point where the subject plays an active part in lawful causal necessity, the point where the subject itself is already inscribed in advance in what appear to be laws of causality independent of the subject. And so the idea here is that for Kant, I can't choose nature. I can't choose all the circumstances of my life. So I can't choose all those factors that are going to be a part of causing me to make particular decisions, right? But what I'm able to do is decide what causes cause me, right? So, you can imagine that there isn't, so, and again, to think of this in Žižekian terms, there's nothing other than the material world, there's nothing other than the natural world. So all the circumstances, all the factors that will cause me to act in particular ways are already there in that natural world. But they don't give an explanation of necessity about exactly why I do what I do. So if you want to have that explanation, you almost like need this stopgap between the causes to say, and this is why this cause caused it, and not some other cause. And then you get this Žižekian quote. So, causes only affect me insofar as I allow them to affect me. And this is why you can because you must, which is a famous Kantian phrase. Every external impossibility to which excuse I know I must, but I cannot, it is impossible refers, relies on a disavowed self-limitation. And then you have this idea here. And I'm just going to read out here. Freedom is inherently retroactive. At its most elementary, it's not simply a free act, which out of nowhere imitates a causal link, but is a retroactive act endorsing which link or sequence necessitates or will determine me. This is where it gets a bit trippy, okay? This is the best way I can imagine it. You know how when we think of like cause and effect, we tend to think of it this way. Cause, effect. And that effect becomes another cause, which leads to another effect, which leads to another cause, which leads to another effect. Right, so think of it that way. Instead, think of it this way. When we say there's a cause and effect, we're doing an incredible act of simplification. So let's say we're talking about billiard balls, to use the Humean example. One ball moves and hits another ball, and that causes that ball to move. And we can say the ball, and we can do a physics, I don't know if you know physics, so it's not going to be a very good explanation. But the movement of the ball and the force of the ball made the other ball move, blah, blah, blah. It's a mathematical equation. That's the cause. But think of everything that account of causality leaves out. I had to have a table there. What caused the table to exist? I had to have the balls existing in the first place. What caused the balls to exist? Why are the balls even being moved? Who's moving them? Is it just a game of pool, or is it actually in a science experiment? What about the room where the table is existing so the balls can move themselves? Anything that actually occurs would have an infinite sequence of actual and an infinitely complex series of causes. So anytime we talk about this cause led to this effect, we're really simplifying things. We're taking a huge, complex, all the possible ways in which this cause and effect can happen, and we're saying it's this cause and to this effect, which doesn't mean it's false. It just means it's leaving stuff out, which you have to do if you're going to understand anything, right? So now the Hegelian twist is this. Once, instead of thinking there's a cause and effect, so it had to happen that way, think of it this way. We don't know what the cause is until we've got the effect. That is, the effect retroactively determines what its own cause is. And I've been trying to think today of an example to help explain this point. But because it's not backwards causation, it's that out of the infinite complexity of things, the idea that when you say something is a cause and effect, what you pick out as the effect is already going to determine what becomes salient as the cause. Yeah. And there's nothing, so that what looks like this necessary chain of events is actually only retroactively necessary. there's nothing, when the cause is happening, there's nothing that says this has to be the effect. It's rather that the whole thing happens, and then you go, because of that effect, that means the cause was most likely here. It retroactively creates it. So Žižek has this strange thing, like with this concept of freedom, it's actually the past that's open, not the future. And I'm going to explain that with an example. But here, can we talk about like presupposing the presuppositions, positing the presuppositions? So when Hegel talks about presupposing, that's associated with the in itself, that's associated with substance. Whereas the for itself is associated with something that something with intentional activity is doing, an agent, for instance. So Žižek's construal of Kant's practical philosophy in this context, subject capacity to be spontaneously self-determining consists in nothing more than its ability to freely determine, that is, posit, which potential determinants, that is, presuppositions as the palpable background of various pressing circumstances, inclinations, situations, urges, and so on, will be actually determining of its effectively realized conduct. A potential cause becomes an actual cause only after the fact of generating and ensuing actual effect. The logical status of cause is conferred upon something après coup through the retroaction of something else subsequently being conceptualizable as an effect in connection with something prior. Or one could say the effect posits its cause as its preceding presupposition. Now, so an example would be, I'm just going to use, sorry, I come back to really primitive examples like people just hitting each other. They're not good, but let's say someone slaps me and I slap them back. And you say, what caused that? It's like, what caused it is that they hit me first. And so I hit them back. That's what caused it. That's just a natural human reaction to that. But let's say I make a different decision. This person hits me and I refrain from hitting them. What caused that? It's like, well, I have this principled belief in non-violence. Now, you see how in that situation, there's a sense in which I'm not controlling anything in my world. In both worlds, I'm being hit. In both worlds, there's a me that's substantial, that has some sense of, that has like things, I mean, for instance, me being non-violent is not something that in a way I've self-caused. It's been this effect of my upbringing, right? But in each situation, I've retroactively determined the cause of the effect. I decide what's causing it. Am I going to be caused by the person hitting me and just react to that and just following my instincts? Or am I going to be caused by this principled thing that's determined? Both of those are part of the natural world. Both of those I haven't really chosen. They've chosen me in a way. But that's how you get that sense of a subjective thing of freedom. And where the determinism comes into it, it's just that when it comes to a human subject, you can't just fill the gaps between natural cause and here's the effect. It's like there's always got to be that thing of, no, the subject is the answer to, yeah, but why that one and not the other one? Why did you choose not to hit them instead of hitting them? What was that thing that made the difference between those two outcomes? It's like, well, it's not really anything. I can't point to anything in substance and say, well, it's this. It's more that there was something happened, the person was hit or they weren't hit, and why did that happen and not something else? What was the cause? What was the causal chain that led to it? And in either account, you have this tiny gap where you just have to fill it with the subject is like a stopgap. So in both situations, it's not that I could choose either one of the options, right? But in choosing either option, I'm not choosing out of nothing. I'm choosing what causes determine me because I'm a determined being. So in either account, if I hit them back, I'm determined. If I choose not to hit them back, I'm determined by my upbringing. Either way, I'm determined. But either way, there's still a subject there, choosing what determines it. Then you get the idea of where the freedom comes from. What am I positing as my presuppositions, as Hegel would say? And here's another line from Žižek, from Less Than Nothing. So the common sense, which I think makes this point quite nicely from the quote we started with. The common sense dialectics of freedom and necessity conceives of their articulation in the sense of the famous lines from the beginning of Marx's 18th Premiere on Louis Bonaparte. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. We are partially, but not totally determined. We have a space of freedom, but within the coordinates imposed by our objective situation. Which sounds very Žižekian, but then he goes, no, that's not quite right. What this view fails to take into account is the way our freedom, free activity, retroactively creates, posits its presuppositions of our activity. And vice versa. The space of our freedom itself is sustained by the situation in which we find ourselves. The excess is thus double. We are not only less free than we think, the contours of our freedom are predetermined. We are simultaneously more free than we think. We freely posit the very necessity that determines us. And this is why, to arrive at our absolute freedom, the free positing of presuppositions, we have to pass through absolute determinism, which is I've been trying to explain. Don't know if I've been successful. So that's the retroactive structure of freedom, right? Freedom is inherently retroactive. It's not a voluntarist idea of freedom, which out of nowhere creates a new chain. It's where you endorse a particular chain that's already determining you. You choose the chain that's going to determine you. So the subject here is not something that decides, it's like the minimal distance that occupies itself from itself that marks the inconsistency of identity. And to give an example, imagine a conversion event. So we're going to imagine someone called Timmy. And Timmy's like, should I be a Marxist? So he's like, well, I'm going to start, what do I have to do with Marxist? You're looking at Marxism. So Timmy starts doing all these things, which we could call the inner stuff, just things that are substantial. So he attends Marxist meetings. He writes angry things about capitalism on social media. He subscribes to Marxist YouTube channels. Now, at what point do you say that Timmy is actually a Marxist? At what point does Timmy go from being regular Timmy to being Marxist Timmy? And that subject is just a vanishing mediator between those two, which will disappear as soon as it appears. But it's what has to be there for that conversion to happen. So one day you're talking to Timmy. It's like, Timmy, you're a Marxist? And he'd be like, oh, I've been looking into it. I've been reading some stuff, been going to meetings, read something angry on YouTube about capitalism. I'm not sure if I'm a Marxist though. But then the next day he's like, I'm a Marxist. Completely Marxist. What's the difference between those two Timmys? At what point does Timmy become a Marxist? And you can think about this for anything, like anyone who has any sort of commitment that they stick to, or even going back to the example of love. At what point did you know that you loved that person and they were the love of your life and so on? And what you find is that there is no point of decision in a way. There's Kierkegaard talks about it as a move between a quantitative shift and a qualitative shift. I can add, I can take a thing of water and I can add degrees to it slowly, make it warmer and warmer and warmer, but at some point it switches into something boiling. There's a qualitative shift. And something seems to happen also with converted Marxism. Timmy studies Marxism, he reads Marx, and so on, but he's not Marxist yet. He's still but all of a sudden it's like, no, now I'm Marxist. And there's a shift from the way that Timmy now relates to all those different substantial things that he was actually involved in. And all of a sudden, this is the thing, once Timmy becomes a Marxist, he was always already going to be a Marxist. Do you know how we like to talk about, like you have this idea of a romantic love, it's all fated. Like for Žižek, there's actually a point to that. It really is in a sense fated. But the point is, it's not written forwards, it's written backwards. That's where fate exists. So once Timmy decides to become a Marxist and affirms a Marxism, and he affirms all these presuppositions that led to me being that, and just takes a different subjective stance in relation to all those substantial things. Once he does that, it's like he rewrites his past so that every single thing he's ever done in his past actually led to this moment. In the same way that when you suddenly realize I'm in love with this person, all of a sudden every single encounter you had with them inevitably led you to this. This was the only way it could ever be. What's happening there is that, fate is real, but the point is the fate doesn't become real until we choose it to be real. But once we choose that, we posit our presuppositions, and then everything we've chosen the things that have caused it. So there's nothing happening when Timmy converts to Marxism. You can point to all the causes for what led him to do it, but none of those causes is sufficient for Timmy to make that extra gesture of going, but now I am a Marxist, and completely rewriting his past so that everything he did would never led to this decision. Once Timmy decides to become a Marxist, he was always already going to be a Marxist. And if in 10 years' time, he marries into money, and now, conveniently decides that no, Marxism is a load of rubbish, and it's just great that some people have more money than other people. Then it's always that if he makes another decision, now it's going to be a different story. Now he's rewritten his past to say it was actually Marxism was just a phase, and it was false. And the truth now is this, right? So that's how the freedom functions in terms of presupposing. You never see the point where you choose that necessity. Once it's chosen, it was always already going to be chosen. But nevertheless, you can't just point to all of Timmy's Marxist commitments and say, oh, that's why he's a Marxist. There's always that extra thing. It's like, no, there's a different, when he chooses to be a Marxist, there's a different way in which he's relating to all those things that isn't quite captured, and which isn't a something. It's not something in substance. It's something like the way that the incompleteness in substance is related to itself. It's like it's the subject, and we see the subject emerging there again. It's this point of nothing. Žižek calls it like this vanishing mediator. We have to posit that there was a point where Timmy decided I'm a Marxist now, but we don't see it anywhere in substance. All we see is pre-Marxist Timmy and Marxist Timmy. Marxist Timmy was inevitable once Marxist Timmy happens. But we know that if that happened, there was a point where he shifted. And that point of nothingness between the two, that's the subject. So, yeah, the vanishing mediator. Okay. That's what they start to. So, and Žižek points out, there's no contradiction between this fatalistic aspect of Hegelian dialectics, the idea that we are simply taking note of what has already happened, and his claim to conceive substance and subject. Both really aim at the same conjunction, because the subject is precisely a name for this empty gesture, which changes nothing at the level of positive content. At this level, everything has already happened, but must nevertheless be added for the content itself to achieve its full subjectivity. So in the case of falling in love, you deciding that you're in love with someone doesn't change any of the actual circumstances of your meeting them. It doesn't change the past, but it changes the way you relate to the past. It changes what the past is. And in a sense, if you choose not to, be in love with them, not that you choose that, it would be chosen for you, but that past will be different, right? So it's the past that's always open, not the future, for Hegel and Žižek. The subject of desire is not substance, so it's not a thing which persists in time, but an entirely non-substantial eventual entity which disappears even before it appears, which appears in and through its very disappearance as a result of its very failure to be. And this is why its structure involves a specific temporality, the temporality of something that never is, but always only will have been. That's the vanishing mediator. Subject is vanishing mediator. I think I've explained that pretty well. It's pretty good. Yeah, okay. So now questions. And then, yes, we'll look at the act. So I might just go straight to the act, actually. I'm going to go straight to the act and come back to this. So the act is Žižek's then name for a... these are, for him, expressions of true freedom that actually will disturb the coordinates of a particular symbolic system. So with Foucauldian historicism, with new historicism, you often get a discursive materialism. You end up with a really pessimistic and depressed view of the world that says, once you're in a discursive structure, any attempt to defy that discursive structure will end up reinforcing those dynamics of power. So how can you act in such a way that you're no longer reinforcing that dominant system, so that you actually are acting outside of that system? So Žižek draws on Lacan's concept of the passageway act to theorize a way of acting that goes outside those ideologically determined symbolic coordinates for the reality. And it's basically this. So this is his most definition of what an authentic act is. But basically it's what we've already spoken about, right? In our ordinary reality, our symbolic world, our big other, gives us these options that we can do. And an act is when you completely change the options that you're being given. So rather than using your freedom to make a choice within the coordinates that are given to you, you act in such a way that you completely defy the big other's ability to say these are your only options, and you give a new option. So this is Žižek's definition. In our ordinary activity, we effectively just follow the virtual phantasmatic coordinates of our identity, while an act proper is the paradox of an actual move which retroactively changes the very virtual transcendental coordinates of its agent's being. or in Freudian terms, which does not only change the actuality of our world, but also moves us underground. And of course, the point here is that when you commit an act, it's not something that you really choose to do. It's more something that happens to you. It's something the subject passes through it, rather than something that you're choosing to do. Examples that Žižek uses. None of these are nice, and this is important because we're going to get to criticism of the act. One of the criticisms of the act is that so these are none of these are really politically efficacious. They don't do much. But the examples that Žižek gives are all horrific. They're all pretty horrible and also almost like purposeless in a way. So one is Antigone choosing to be buried with her brother rather than following Creon's orders. So sort of committing a type of suicide in fidelity to her brother's honor. In Kaiser Soze, I don't know how to say that name, sorry. Soze, in The Usual Suspects, who, when his family is taken hostage, shoots them himself. So people come in and take his family hostage, and they go, we've got your family, you have to do what we tell you to. And instead of letting them do that, he shoots his own family. That's an act. Because it's like, your choice is either follow us or we kill your family. It's like, I've got another option. I shoot my family, and I do whatever I want. Yeah. Seth in Toni Morrison's Beloved, who kills her own daughter rather than hand her over to a life of slavery. So she escapes from slavery. She brings up her own daughter sort of in freedom, but then her original owner turns up and is going to take the daughter away. And unthinkingly, Beloved is an incredible novel. But the way that it's described is like there's just she just goes and takes the daughter apart and just kills her without any hesitation. And without any, and the whole novel is in a way her working through that trauma. But she does it without any hesitation at all. Without ever even, in a sense, you get a feeling like other people judge her and expect an account from her, but she doesn't think she owes it to them. For her, it's obvious, right? So that's another example. I think the end of Squid Game is another one. Apparently, I can't show the copyright reasons, but that's okay. So at the end of Squid Game, you come down. Does everyone know like the basic premise of Squid Game? And so, like the last person gets, I don't know how much money. It's a lot of money. So basically, they have all these people. And they go through competition after competition, and every competition, some people die. But the last person standing is going to win a whole heap of money. So it gets down to the last two people who are old friends. And it's now a one-on-one battle to the death. And whoever survives will get the money. And the main protagonist beats up his friend, and he's basically about to kill him and claim all the money. But at the last moment, he goes, you know what, this is stupid. Because one of the rules of Squid Game is, if at any one, both people decide to quit the games, then they just get to go home. And so he says, let's just stop playing the game. Like, I quit, and we'll just both go home. That's the example of the act. It's like in that coordinates, his choice was supposed to be either you kill or you're killed. And instead he sort of says, no, let's forget the game. I'm not going to play this game anymore. We're both going to go home. And I'm renouncing the money. And the people watching, the rich people watching, they can't believe it and so on. But then his friend kills himself so he can't get the money. But that's the example of the act, right? It's like, here are the coordinates I'm supposed to follow. I'm going to do something completely different. And in doing so, show the weakness of these very coordinates. That these people who have been running this whole game actually don't have that power over me. Okay, so the act is related to the drive. So in these things, when people act in these ways, it's almost like they're compelled to beyond things that they can control. And here, I think it's really important to think that when you think of the death drive now, we have to begin to think of these two aspects. There's a negative withdrawal aspect. So there's a part in which these people are withdrawing from reality. But then there's this positive insistent aspect of repetition, where you're willing to go through to a particular act, like to the end. And an example of this is Bartleby the Scrivener, Žižek talks about in the Paradise View, the end of the Paradise View, and becomes a model for him of this political act. So the story is of this guy who is a scrivener, which means he just copies legal documents all day. And so this guy hires him. It's told from the perspective of the person who hired him, and he just sort of says this guy was weird. And he hires him, and this guy's an amazing worker. He's there first thing in the morning. He's the last one to leave, and he just copies at an amazing rate. And then one day this guy goes, oh, I need help checking something. So he calls Bartleby to his office. He goes, hey, can you help me just check this document? And Bartleby goes, I prefer not to. He's like, oh, but no, I'm telling you to. Bartleby goes, yeah, but I prefer not to. They go, okay, so go back. And then the next time, like there's like a group of them, they've got to check these documents, and it's much faster to do as a group. So he calls Bartleby in. Bartleby, we need you in here again. just read this document out. We're going to check these documents all right. And Bartleby's like, I prefer not to. He's like, what do you mean you prefer not to? You can't prefer not to employ you. He's like, yeah, I prefer not to. I don't want to do that. And he just goes back to his work. And this guy, and then he sort of gets worse and worse, and then Bartleby just stops copying anything. And then he's saying, going, why aren't you copying anything? You're not even doing any work anymore. And Bartleby's like, yeah, I'm not going to do copies anymore. I don't want to do it. I prefer not to. And he just spends all his time just staring at a window at a brick wall. And then the employer gets to the point where he's like, that's it. You know what? We've got to have this. There's one great part. He goes to his own office on Sunday, and he can't get in. The key won't work, and the door opens, and Bartleby's there. He's like, "What are you doing at the office? It's Sunday." And Bartleby's like, "Oh, you can't come in at the moment. I'm busy, but just come back in a couple of hours and come into your own office." And then he works out Bartleby hasn't even been going home. He just spends all his time in his front office, and he doesn't do anything all day. And the only thing he eats is ginger cakes. He never goes out. And then he gets to the point where he's like, "That's it. Like, you're not doing any work. Like, you're fired. So pack up your stuff and leave. You're fired." And Bartleby just goes, "Oh, I prefer not to. I'm not leaving." And so he's just stuck in this office, and he can't get him out of this office. And he just starts running his legal profession with Bartleby just standing in the middle of the room looking out his window. And everyone's like, "Who's this guy?" And he's like, "You just have to ignore him. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't want to do anything." And then he's like, "Okay, Bartleby, it got so bad that he's like, I have to move office now because you're ruining everything. I'm leaving the office, Bartleby. So I'm gone. We're packing up." So they pack up everything, and he moves to an office across town. And Bartleby still doesn't move, and he's still there. Then a week later, some people go down to the guy, and he's like, "Who's this crazy guy who's left in the property? You can't leave a guy on the property." He's like, "I didn't leave him there. I hired him, and he just won't leave. And like, you got to come and get him. He won't leave. He won't leave." Anyway, the end of the story is they kick him out of the office eventually, but even then he won't leave. He's hanging around the building, he bothers everyone. Eventually he's arrested, he just starves to death in prison. But the point is, there's something great about this. Like, he just goes, "No matter what, I prefer not to." And this person who tries to control him just says, "Look, what do these people think you should do?" And they go, "Yeah, you should do it. Yeah, your boss, you should tell him what to do." And Bartleby isn't mean. He's not angry at anyone. He's not emotionally invested. It's not about a pride thing. He's just like, "No, I'm not doing that." It's like this consistent, repetitive refusal, which completely throws everything else around him out of whack. Like, no one can function in the space around him because he's like this stain of this, and it is a good example of like this insistent of his death drive. So this is like a politics of refusal and a possibility for Žižek of a new political movement. So what's distinctive about Bartleby's refusal for Žižek is that it doesn't involve challenging or negation of any particular content. So it's not that Bartleby's like going, "I don't like you," or "No, I'm morally opposed to that." He's just like, "I'm not doing it." It's just like this insistence on pure ethics of subtraction, right? And yeah, so he sort of sees it as like this. There's a tense in which there's a refusal of an entire social order there, which really becomes clear in the novel when Bartleby, no one can cope with Bartleby, but all he's actually doing is nothing. It's literally all he's doing is nothing, and they don't know what to do with him. So for Žižek, that's like an example of what of someone who just insists on being that stain of the subject would look like. And Pfeiffer makes some interesting points on Bartleby is here as almost like being a positive thing, that it starts as this purely negative activity of this refusal, but that refusal, once it's repeated, has this interpolative effect, which then constitutes this subject that almost becomes his own thing of interpolation. In a way, he begins to interpolate himself. He becomes attached to nothing other than his own insistence on preferring not to. And here you have like a figure of someone who's of like a perfect example of the drive erupting in symbolic space and not being reducible or controllable or to anything. Okay, criticisms of the act. I don't think I'm going to try to do this because that would be, I'm going to come back to here and just come back to this part, the difficult part to understand, and just conclude with this. So this is and here, and I struggle with this stuff as well. Because we're going, have we actually got a substantial definition of freedom? What would like a cognitive scientist say in response to this? And I think what, I don't know, obviously they'd say is like, "Oh, yeah, good. I love your canteen had yelling and mumbo jumbo." But in the end, all we can measure and all we can see are these neurons and these material things. And I'm not going to take a version of reality that's other than those. What would a response to that materialist be? And I've got a pretty good response here, I think, which is the same response I've made elsewhere. And Žižek's latest book, the guy by Michael Pinkham says this: responding to a physicist who believes there's no free will, who called Hossenfelder. Hossenfelder is wrong to deny the reality of free will. I think a critique of physicists who deny superdeterminism because it denies free will has salience. But the denial of free will is self-refuting regardless of the issues in theoretical physics. Free will is a precondition for all science, all reasoning, and all claims to know the truth. As noted above, if free will is not real, then all of our actions, including our investigations of reality, are determined by the laws of nature, which in themselves are not propositions and have no truth value. Thus, if free will is not real, human thought has no access to truth. To deny free will is to assert it, and any denial of free will on any basis whatsoever is nonsensical. If we lack free will, we have no justification whatsoever to believe that we lack free will. That would sort of be my reply. It's like, if you're going to stand there and convince me that I don't have any free will, who or what is this thing convincing me? Because if you're actually just an effect of natural causes, then you don't have a capacity to stand back and decide what you really believe. So what are you doing? You're just an expression of natural things. There's no reasoning. There's no ability to make decisions. There's no rational person who can sort of step back from things and convince me of something. So unless you have some account of freedom, you can't even make the argument that we don't have freedom, at least to a hard determinist. So for me, the hard determinist position just leads to a performative contradiction. You can claim you're a hard determinist, but whoever is claiming that, they don't really believe it, because otherwise they're not claiming anything, right? They're just an every phenomenal thing making noise. Secondly, the other thing about hard determinism is it does rely on this idea that there's only one way, that there's only one way in which things can work out. So the ideal path is big. And that's just not something you can ever prove scientifically. Like, you could never do any experiment that shows there's only one possible way that things can happen. That's just a metaphysical assumption. And if anything, science would show us it's actually really hard to make things happen repeatedly the way we want them to. We have to go through a lot of effort to make controlled experiments. So the idea there's only one way in which things can happen, which is a metaphysical assumption, which is it can fit with science, but it's not something you can ever actually show. And for me, you have to have those two things to even begin to make a claim that you have free will. Neither of those come up against the real problem of you've got a performative contradiction there, which I think is the big problem. But is there also a problem here that, again, have we solved the problem of Žižek going from, okay, material reality isn't finished, which means that we have the capacity for freedom. But does that mean that we have the capacity for self-determination? Do we have that stronger sense of freedom that I'm choosing something? I think Žižek does have an account for that. You just have to be willing to let go of the idea that when you talk about choosing something, you're something outside of nature. When we're talking about assuming a necessity, those necessities are really come from and what we call the natural world or the substantial world. So long as you're willing to let go of that idea, then I don't think there's really a problem. A problem with, I do think his freedom is about self-determination. It's just not a self-determination that you're making what you're committed to out of nothing. When we determine something, when we determine to express our freedom something, of that thing that we're committed to, and the sense that we have of why we need to follow it through are very much all caused by the substantial features of our world. But they're just not enough. That nature itself is just not enough to completely, there's always a gap where we have to choose what determines us. And then that's where the subject comes about. The key thing, and this is the thing that I really struggle with, that you have to get rid of, is freedom. You have to accept that Hegelian Kantian idea of freedom. Freedom ultimately is not about doing whatever you want. It's those moments or those things where it's like, no, this is something I'm committed to, and I'll follow this through to the end. And where you're insistent upon some course of action, almost like for its own sake. That's when you have genuine freedom. Not when, and that's just so different from how we normally conceptualize freedom in our dominant culture, where it's no, freedom is just, free to do what I want in your time. Don't tell me what to do. I want to be free. All that sort of stuff. That's just a very very different way to conceptualize freedom. So my argument is, yes, I do think it does provide a robust account of freedom, but it's just hard to grasp because it goes so much against all of the way in which we normally think of freedom.